Welcome back to the Lafayette Ledger podcast. This is the Hong Kong episode. I'm your host, Chris Constantino, and this is your host,
Colton.
And as I said, today we're going to focus on the situations going down with Hong Kong. It's a very serious matter. A lot of people in our country feel like we should be doing a lot more to help these people out. And before we get started on the political situations that are ramping up now, I'm going to hand it over to Colton for a brief history on how it came to be and sort of the legislation that made this weird, sticky situation in China and Hong Kong. Technically, they're not even the same sort of government legislation type, different governments, and it's a whole sort of deal. So I'm going to have Colton explain that for you.
Thank you very much. As some of you might know and some might not know the geography of how China and Hong Kong are together, it's obviously separate, but they're still considered to be under one rule. Hong Kong is a former British colony handed back to China in 1997. It has its own judiciary and separate legal system, and from mainland China, that is. Those rights include freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and as such, that communist China does not have, or more communist-like China. As we know, in recent years, it's gotten less communist, but still more than other countries.
And even so, in that sort of view, the communist part of China has always been its government. I want to say it's more of they've always run with a capitalistic economic system because that's what works. And that's really the only sort of economic system that works. Even when you see these totalitarian governments like Third Reich or the USSR. The USSR, with the oligarchs, so the people who had the power because they had money, still used their sort of closed off economic system. But even then, the communism is what killed the USSR. Third Reich used capitalism. And the DPKR only uses communism. You see the effects of what happens. You get people who are starving. You get buildings that are made just to make the appearance of a growing city. And in China, the reason it stayed alive for as long as it should be as bad off as Korea. Yet somehow, North Korea specifically, yet somehow they're arguably the most important trade nation in the entire world. And they are the backbone of thousands of countries that have trade as their foreign diplomatic main relations. And that is because they've always used the capitalistic economic system, more so totalitarian rule. They call it communism, but in an essence, it's just communism through ruling. So you have these people that decide how the laws work and how property gets divided. But when it comes to actual in-market trade, because of the inevitability of running into a foreign market that is laissez-faire to mixed, so you have capitalism mixed with a little bit of governmental control, you cannot have a communistic market and still be the dominant trade superpower that China is. And the government itself, when it has that communistic rule, it's really just a pseudo-totalitarian rule. They're just as bad as the Third Reich was when it comes to controlling. These people have a hold on the Chinese people's lives, and they refuse to give it up. And what we're seeing here with Hong Kong is finally somebody willing to stand up and fight.
Indeed, China does have a very interesting, such a very interesting history, but also system of government, just where they do have capitalist tendencies when it comes to trade and how they conduct business. Actually, a very common thing is Chinese people come over to countries such as America, Britain, all that for education on a lot of times economics, and they use that in their own way. But at the same time, you see, like you were saying, a lot of control, especially when it comes to social life, law. What was the recent thing with locking people up of certain religions? Religion is very much controlled, if not banned, in communist China, or modern China.
Yeah, I agree with you there. And another whole fear of that is You could closet practice these things. You wouldn't have to be worried about it. But however, China has now become over the top with their technology and the fact that if you are seen on the street by the AI that China has, the idea is identifies you. They can display anything you've ever done in your life, any pictures. They have complete control over your public identity and can spot you doing a crime, which is why in a lot of these protests you see a lot of people wearing masks. It was a big development that people started using lasers to block the face recognition AI because if you were caught protesting, that's instantly thrown in jail. We take this right. We have the First Amendment. We have the freedom of speech. The fact that we can protest, we take that for such granted because these people want change, and the only real way to do that is to protest. And yet, if they do, they're risking being locked up for their entire lives. And finally, we see here somebody finally trying to make a change. We have this man named Joshua Wong. He's a pro-democracy Hong Kong activist you may not have heard about because now, by mainland China, he's been barred from election. We have what is the idea of democracy? We want a sort of a consensus of the people. We need that, and we're so close. Hong Kong was so close to having this leader, a young leader, a pro-democracy leader, this Joshua Wong man, and now he's been barred from the election. It's like they purposefully try to mainland China. Its whole goal is it's so easy to see that they're trying to suffocate Hong Kong from this sort of point of we have all the power in the area. What are you gonna do? You know?
Yeah, that's very interesting how they can just, you see this in uh, totalitarian governments throughout history, just getting rid of the competition. However, that may be if it's more passive or more aggressive, as in the Nazis. They'd kill off their competition. Now others would just throw them in prison.
Yeah, man. And you think that in a world such as today, where we have so many things in place to prevent things like this, it wouldn't be possible. And not only that, we rely on China for our market. We've stopped stabilizing ourselves with our own production. We were never a really true self-providing country. We were back in World War II because we needed it. But now we've gotten so lazy and so compliant with relying on China and other foreign markets that we have to rely on a nation that's pretty much just as bad leadership wise as some of the worst totalitarian governments out there. We like to pretend that China and Korea, North Korea specifically again, is on two different levels, but they're not. They're the complete thing. It's just you don't hear about what happens in China because the government doesn't want you to hear about it. You can call that a conspiracy, you can call that whatever you want. But my main point of view here is if you seriously don't believe that America isn't censoring a good amount of things about China they actually know, then you're a joke. I mean, these are our main reliance as a trade or as a foreign trade partner. And
you're listening right now, check your shirt tag. I'm pretty sure it says made in China.
Exactly. Anything you're holding, anything you're wearing, it's made in an Asian company or in an Asian country, typically China, and they're all owned by a huge monopoly named Tencent, a huge Chinese company. I mean, we like to pretend that we're some isolated superpower that's never affected. But almost every company in the entire country of America is owned by Tencent, or at least Tencent has a good amount of shares. I mean, we have a gaming company named Blizzard. Not sure if you know this, but they released a game called Overwatch, and there's a huge conundrum with the way they work because now we have the problem with them censoring and pulling back Chinese players that wrote for pro democracy. And we see the NBA criticizing people for choosing to be pro democracy.
We see a lot of pop culture, supporting Hong Kong, which is great. But then we see a lot of these companies that for some reason have always seemed American to us. Like the NBA seems very American to us. However, when you look at it, why do you think they don't have a public opinion on the Hong Kong affairs? Why do you think they don't side with the Hong Kong supporters? It's because Tencent owned the major portion of their companies. Tencent is genius in the fact that it literally buys up companies by the boatload and won't stop until that company is pretty much at the mercy of the Chinese government, which operates through Tencent, giving them funding to control different companies. And in a mixed market economy, having control of the biggest companies is essentially having control of the people. And you see these different reactions to it. It explains why they're there. It's because the companies go, wait a minute, are we going to lose our greatest investors from one person's feelings on a place that we're not even involved in? And it's inhumane that they think like that. You should be worried about these Hong Kong people that need help, that don't want to be thrown in jail forever. They don't want to be treated like subhuman people, and yet just because of a couple dollars, they do it anyways.
Well, you know, I think with thank you, I appreciate that. You know, I believe that as Americans, or honestly, as people, we really have to look into the whole human rights side of these things. And that's one thing a lot of these Hong Kong protesters believe is at stake is their human rights. As we were saying earlier, there's a lot of suppression, um, just overall oppression, and you start to see these protests getting more violent and more. Not necessarily the protests themselves, but just the clash between protesters and police, and they're using tear gas, and I believe we have a few dead at this point, and many have been jailed. And the leaders of these protests have been calling to negotiate with officials, specifically the president of China, and they just won't have it. They don't want to adhere to their demands or what they're asking for.
Which of those demands is a common motto called the Five Demands, not one less motto. And it's a very, very specific happening because they have 5 rules that they need completed in order to come in accordance with this. First is for the protest not to be characterized as a riot. Obviously, number one, a riot can not be defended legally. It's a riot. It's not a protest. A protest is given for democracy. Under democracy, a protest is a necessary movement by the people to instill a change in the government they live in. However, this is no such thing. They have a riot. They call it a riot. The Chinese government calls it a riot, and you can get thrown in jail even in a democracy for that. So the goal of these protests in Hong Kong is this. It goes along with this motto they've adopted: the 5 demands, not one less. And the 5 demands themselves are for the protests, obviously, not to be characterized as a riot. Like I said, they can easily be thrown in jail for a riot, even under a pro-democracy government. Now, the next one, which I haven't mentioned, is amnesty for arrested protesters. So there's obviously been people hurt, there's been people tortured, people thrown in jail, families separated from these protests, and it's not a good thing. These people are getting hurt over something they believe is
Just
right.
simply wanting human rights.
Yeah, simply wanting human rights. And what they want is freedom for these people and complete wiping off their track record for that incident because they don't deserve to go to jail for that. They need to be treated with more respect.
So the 5 demands, we've said
We've
the
gone
motto
through
is
one and two.
five demands, no, not one less. That's their motto.
And we've gone through
One and two.
The
The third will be an independent inquiry to alleged police brutality. That's something I think any of us can relate to. Like whether you're doing something,
legal or not, it's